I had rented out a small hunting cabin deep in the northern woods of Minnesota back in the fall of 1996. I was 32 at the time, and I had been working long shifts at a steel plant for months without a proper break. A friend of mine told me about the cabin. Cheap, isolated, surrounded by state forest. He said it was perfect if I wanted peace, a bit of hunting, and no one around to bother me. That sounded exactly like what I needed. The cabin sat about 12 miles from the nearest paved road. The last stretch was nothing more than a 2-track dirt path, muddy in some places, swallowed up by thick pines on both sides. I drove out there in an old pickup, bouncing along the ruts, the back weighed down with a week's worth of food, my rifle, some extra clothes, a lantern, and an old cooler. It took nearly an hour to crawl down that stretch because of all the washouts, and once I parked, I realized just how far I was from anything else. No cell phones back then that worked out here, no neighbors, no quick drive to town. It was me, the cabin, and miles of dark forest. The cabin itself looked rough but sturdy. The logs were gray from years of weather, the roof patched with old tin, the porch sagging a little. Inside, it smelled like old wood, damp dirt, and mouse droppings. A single room with a stove in the corner, a rickety table, and a narrow cot against the wall. There was no electricity, just a stack of old candles and a kerosene lamp. I swept the floor with a branch broom someone had left behind and unpacked my gear. Felt empty, but I told myself that was the point. I came here to be alone. The first couple of days went smoothly. I spent mornings walking the woods with my rifle, afternoons chopping kindling or sitting on the porch with a thermos of coffee. The silence out there was thick, broken only by the calls of crows or the wind pushing through the trees. Nights were colder than I expected. By sunset, the woods turned pitch black, so black I couldn't see my own boots if I stepped off the porch. The only sound was the crackle of the fire and the occasional snap of a branch outside. On the fourth night, something changed. I had finished a small dinner, beans from a can and bread, and was sitting by the stove when I heard something outside. First, I thought it was just the wind. Then it came again, a crunch in the dirt near the porch steps, slow, heavy. I froze and listened. A second crunch. Something was definitely moving out there. My rifle leaned against the wall near the door, but I didn't want to get up too quickly. I sat in silence, holding my breath, staring at the dark window. The noise stopped after a few moments, replaced by silence so complete it made my ears ring. I told myself it was probably a deer. This was hunting country after all. I let the fire burn low and crawled onto the cot, though it took hours before I finally slept. The next morning, I found tracks in the dirt outside the cabin. At first glance, I thought they were from a deer, but when I knelt down, I saw they weren't shaped right. They were boots. Someone had been standing just a few feet from my porch during the night. The tracks led from the tree line to the steps and then circled around the cabin before heading back into the woods. The boot size looked close to mine. I stood there for a long time, staring at those prints. I hadn't seen another person in days, hadn't heard a single engine or chainsaw. Whoever left them had walked out here through miles of thick forest, and they had come close enough to look in my windows. I kept my rifle close the rest of that day. I didn't go far from the cabin, just chopped more wood and tried to keep myself busy. The forest felt different now. The silence wasn't peaceful anymore. It was heavy, waiting. Every time a branch snapped, I turned with my rifle, expecting someone to be there. That night, I barred the door with a heavy piece of wood and kept the lantern low. I stayed awake longer than usual, sitting on the cot with the rifle across my lap. Around midnight, I heard it again. This time, it wasn't just a step. Something scraped along the back wall of the cabin, slow, deliberate, like someone dragging their hand across the logs. Then it stopped. My skin crawled, and every hair on my body stood up. I wanted to shout, but the sound caught in my throat. Instead, I waited, listening, gripping the rifle so tight my hands hurt. Minutes passed. Then another sound, a faint thud near the window. I didn't dare move closer. I just sat in the dark, staring, waiting. After a while, the noises stopped, and the forest went silent again. By morning, I forced myself to check. My boots felt heavy as I walked the perimeter of the cabin. Sure enough, fresh prints marked the dirt again, circling the cabin just like before. They were the same size as mine. On the wall, I saw faint smudges, like fingers had been dragged across the logs. I decided then I wasn't staying another night. I packed most of my gear, loaded the cooler, and set it by the door. But when I went to start the truck, it wouldn't turn over. I popped the hood, checked the battery, the cables. Everything looked fine, but the engine just coughed and died. I tried until the battery drained, then sat in the cab sweating despite the cold. The truck had run fine all week. Now it wouldn't start at all. Walking out wasn't a good option. 12 miles of rough road, then another 10 or so before I'd hit a town. The sun was already slipping lower. I had no choice but to spend another night. That evening, I built the fire higher and stacked wood near the door. I kept the rifle loaded and set the lantern beside me. I didn't bother trying to sleep. Around 2 in the morning, I heard it again. Slow steps on the porch. The boards creaked under the weight. Then the doorknob rattled. It wasn't quick, like someone testing it. It turned slow, steady, as if the person outside had all the time in the world. The bar I had set across the door held, but I sat frozen, staring at the knob, the metal shaking back and forth. After what felt like forever, the rattling stopped. Then silence again. When the first light hit the trees, I was already outside, rifle in hand. The tracks were everywhere, around the cabin, across the porch, even leading down toward the truck. My stomach sank when I checked under the hood again. The battery cables had been cut clean through. That was it. Whoever was out there didn't just want to scare me, they wanted me stuck. I packed what I could carry in a backpack, water, a little food, ammo, and left the rest behind. I didn't look back at the cabin as I started walking down the dirt track. Every sound in the forest made me turn. I kept expecting to see someone step out of the trees, but the woods stayed empty. It took hours, my legs burning, throat dry, but I made it to the paved road by late afternoon. A truck finally passed and slowed when they saw me. The driver, a farmer, gave me a ride into town. When I told him where I'd been staying, he just shook his head and muttered that I wasn't the first to come stumbling out of those woods. I never went back for the rest of my gear. I left the cabin and everything in it behind. Even now, almost 30 years later, I can still hear that doorknob rattling in the dark, slow and patient, as if whoever was out there knew I had nowhere else to go. I was 35 years old in the fall of 1998 when I decided to start building a small cabin on a piece of land I had bought just outside of Franklin, North Carolina. The land wasn't much, 3 acres of rough ground, thick trees, and an old dirt path that cut into the hills. But I wanted something of my own, somewhere I could get away from the endless noise of town. I worked at a machine shop and every week felt the same. I thought if I built something with my own hands, I'd at least feel like my life wasn't just passing me by. The cabin was meant to be small, maybe 12 by 12, nothing fancy. Just enough room for a cot, a table, and a wood stove. I had been working on it for about 2 weeks whenever I had time off. It wasn't much more than a frame, some rough boards nailed up, and a half-finished roof. I didn't have money for help, so it was all me. By that Friday night, the weather had turned sour. The forecast warned of heavy rain and wind, but I figured I'd use the evening to at least get more of the roof covered. I didn't want the frame soaking through and warping before I could get shingles on. By the time I got to the property, it was already getting dark. Clouds sat low over the ridge, thick and swollen, and the air smelled like wet leaves. I parked my old Ford pickup at the edge of the trail and carried my tools and a tarp down toward the cabin. It wasn't a long walk, but the path twisted between trees and dropped off in a few steep places, and the soil was soft from earlier drizzle. My boots slid more than once. I told myself it would be quick. Just tack the tarp over the roof and head home. When I reached the clearing where I had started building, the air felt heavier. The cabin sat there like a rough skeleton against the trees, walls half closed, the roof nothing but beams waiting for cover. I dropped my bag of nails and the hammer, unrolled the tarp, and climbed onto the slick beams. The rain started then, not hard at first, just steady drops that hissed as they hit the leaves. I worked quickly, stretching the tarp, nailing it down over the top to keep the wood dry. By the time I finished, the rain had turned harder. Came in sheets, hammering down so loud I couldn't even hear my hammer strikes clearly. Water was already pooling on the ground around the posts. I climbed down, soaked through, and stood inside the frame for a moment, just to feel what it would be like once it was done. That's when I noticed it. At first, I thought it was the rain tricking me, but the sound didn't fit. Beneath the pounding of water and the creak of trees, there was another noise, faint, irregular, like something moving through wet leaves. It wasn't far, maybe 50 feet into the woods. I stood still, listening, my clothes clinging cold to my back. The sound stopped when I stopped. I tried to shake it off. Maybe it was a deer or a raccoon. The woods here were full of them, but as I started gathering my tools into the bag, I heard it again. Closer this time, deliberate steps, slow and careful, like whoever or whatever it was didn't want to be noticed. I felt a tightness crawl up my throat. My hammer was still in my hand, and I gripped it tighter, telling myself it was nothing. But I couldn't ignore how deliberate the noise was. An animal would crash through the brush without caring. But this sounded measured, like someone circling. The rain only made it worse. It blurred everything. The darkness and the trees melting together. My flashlight was in the truck, a mistake I cursed myself for as I tried to see through the thick wall of wet branches. Every now and then, I thought I caught movement, the suggestion of something darker shifting between the trunks, but it was gone before I could be sure. The cabin frame gave little shelter, but I stayed under it, watching, listening, trying not to breathe too loud. My heart pounded harder than the rain. I thought about leaving the tools and just running up the trail to the truck, but the path was narrow and slick, and if someone was out there watching, I'd be wide open. Minutes dragged by. My legs started to ache from standing so stiff. Then the sound came again, this time behind me, on the other side of the clearing. I spun around, hammer raised, but all I saw were the shadows of trees swaying. The rain splashed mud up my jeans, and the tarp above me flapped hard in the wind. Felt like I wasn't alone. I knew it in my gut. The way the steps paused when I paused, the way they circled, never rushing, just keeping distance. Whoever was out there wanted me to know they were there. That unsettled me more than if they had just walked up. I grabbed the tool bag and slung it over my shoulder, deciding I couldn't stay. The rain was only getting heavier, and every second out there felt wrong. I moved toward the trail, slow at first, trying not to slip. My boots sank into the mud, sucking at every step. Halfway to the path, I heard another sound, a sharp crack, like a branch snapping under weight. It was close, too close, maybe 20 feet. I didn't look back. I broke into a run, slipping, catching myself on trees, the bag of tools banging against my side. My breath came out in harsh bursts, mixing with the roar of rain. The trail was worse than I thought. Water rushed down the incline like a stream, turning the dirt into a slick mess. I slid more than once, my knee slamming into a rock, pain shooting up my leg. Still, I forced myself forward. Behind me, for just a second, I swore I heard feet pounding after me. Not the random scatter of an animal, heavy, quick, human. I didn't stop to check. The truck came into view, its dull shape through the curtain of rain. I yanked the door open, threw the bag inside, and slammed it shut. My keys slipped in my wet fingers, but I jammed them into the ignition and twisted. The engine coughed, then roared alive. I didn't wait. I threw it into gear and gunned the gas, tires spinning in the mud before catching on the gravel road. As I drove, I glanced into the mirror. The path behind was nothing but trees and rain. No figure, no movement. But I couldn't shake the certainty that someone had been there, watching, following. I didn't go back for 2 weeks. When I did, the tarp was torn down, ripped almost clean off, not by the wind, but like it had been pulled. The ground around the cabin was a mess of mud, but there were prints. They weren't clear, washed out by the rain, but they were large, longer than my boot, and not the shape of any deer. That night changed how I thought about the land. I still finished the cabin months later, but I never stayed overnight there alone. The place didn't feel like mine anymore. It felt like I had stumbled into something I wasn't meant to, like the woods had eyes that waited for darkness and rain to close in. Even now, all these years later, I can remember the way those steps stopped when I stopped, the way the night pressed in. I never saw who or what it was, and maybe that's worse than knowing. Because sometimes, in the middle of a storm, when I hear rain beating down, I can still feel that same tightness in my chest, like I'm back in that half-built cabin with the dark watching from the trees. I drove through the back roads of northern Michigan late one October evening, the kind of cold, damp night where the trees looked black against the sky and the air pressed heavy on the windshield. The rain had slowed to a mist, but the gravel roads were slick, and the headlights picked up more fog than road at times. I hadn't been down this way in years, not since my divorce. My ex-wife's family owned land out here, a cabin that sat tucked away by a long, narrow trail branching off the main road. I never had a reason to come back. I had told myself for years I wouldn't, but the GPS routed me this way as the shortest path north, and I didn't think much of it until I passed the familiar bend, the big oak with the split trunk, and the half-collapsed mailbox with her family's old name still faintly stenciled on it. That mailbox stirred something inside me I didn't want stirred. The cabin was down the trail, and even though I told myself I wouldn't look, my eyes searched the shadows. The truck's headlights cut through just far enough to show the trailhead, still muddy and rutted, still marked by 2 leaning posts where an old wooden sign once hung. The sight of it pulled me back 10 years in an instant. I remembered the first time I came here with her, summer of 2012. She was laughing, windows down, pointing out deer that darted across the road. I had carried firewood in for her dad, cleaned fish at the lake. That place had once been a strange kind of peace for me. Then it had been something else entirely. I didn't mean to slow down, but my foot eased off the gas as I passed the trail. The trees leaned in tighter there, almost forming a tunnel. I couldn't see the cabin itself, only the first stretch of the track, dark and muddy, going back into the woods. I thought it would be over once I passed, but that uneasy pull clung to me. A mile further up, I stopped. My hands were tight on the wheel, knuckles stiff. I told myself I just needed a minute, just air. But I knew that wasn't it. Against my better judgment, I turned the truck around. The trail was worse than I remembered. Mud sucked at the tires and brush scraped the sides. I drove slow, lights bouncing off the wet trunks, trying to ignore how much it felt like trespassing. No one in her family had been out here in years, I was sure of that. The cabin might even be falling apart by now. When I reached the clearing, my chest tightened. The cabin was still there, dark and hunched, but not collapsed. The roof sagged, moss thick along the shingles, but the walls stood firm. The front steps looked the same, though the railing leaned as if a heavy hand had dragged it down. The place had aged, but it was far from abandoned. The yard was the part that stopped me. The grass was down, not wild like you'd expect after years. The ground looked worn, like someone had been walking paths around the place. There was even a stack of cut wood near the shed. That made my skin crawl more than if the place had been boarded up. Someone had been here recently. I killed the engine. The sudden silence made the woods louder. Branches creaking, water dripping. A faint rush of wind moving through the trees. I sat there for a long time, staring at the cabin, telling myself to just back up and leave. But something about the place kept me pinned. It wasn't nostalgia. It was the opposite. It was dread mixed with the urge to know. I stepped out. The mud was soft, pulling at my boots. The air smelled like wet pine and something faintly sour, like old smoke. My breath came out white in the beam of the headlights. I didn't bring a flashlight, but the moon broke through now and then, giving just enough light to see the cabin's outline. Up close, I saw more signs of use. The front door had a new padlock. Not brand new, but not rusted either. The woodpile had been cut clean, not the rough hacking her dad used to do. And on the porch, faint tracks in the dirt, boots several sizes, maybe more than one person. I didn't want to knock, didn't want to see anyone, but I found myself walking around the side. The windows were dark, curtains drawn. A faint smell of propane hung near the back, where an old tank sat. That meant someone could still be living here, even just on weekends. As I circled back toward the front, I heard it. A sound sharp against the quiet metal on wood, like something being dragged across a floor inside. I froze, every muscle locking up. My ears strained, heart pounding so hard it drowned the wind. Then it came again, longer this time, like a chair sliding slow. The cabin wasn't supposed to be occupied. Her family hadn't mentioned it in years. No one had reason to live out here. But there I was, standing 10 feet away, listening to someone moving inside. My first thought was squatters. That would make sense, someone living off the grid, using the place for shelter. But the neat woodpile, the cut grass, the lock, it didn't feel like squatters. It felt like someone keeping it. I backed up slow, boots sinking in mud, trying not to make a sound. The porch groaned faintly, but the noise inside stopped as if whoever was there had heard me. The silence that followed was worse than the sound itself. I turned and walked fast toward the truck. Every step felt too loud. I didn't look back, not until I opened the driver's side door. That's when I glanced up. One of the curtains had shifted, just a sliver, but enough. I couldn't see a face, but I knew someone was there, watching. The curtain stilled. My throat went dry. I climbed in, started the engine, headlights washing the cabin in white. For a second, I thought I'd see someone step out onto the porch. No one did, but I didn't wait. I threw it in reverse, tires spitting mud, backing down the trail faster than I should have. Branches scraped, the truck bounced, but I didn't slow until I hit the main road. I didn't stop again until I was 10 miles out, back on pavement, surrounded by nothing but black trees in the mirror. My hands shook on the wheel. I knew then that cabin wasn't abandoned. Someone had taken it. Maybe someone who had no right to be there, maybe someone dangerous. But it wasn't mine to question anymore. The part that sat in my chest like a stone was the thought that whoever was inside had stood in the same place I had, looking out through the same glass, watching me. I had walked right up into their silence, and they had let me. I didn't call the sheriff, didn't mention it to anyone. I just kept driving, telling myself it wasn't my business anymore. But the image of that curtain moving has never left me. Even now, years later, I think about it when I drive dark back roads. That quiet knowledge that sometimes it's not the abandoned places you need to fear. It's the ones still being used quietly by someone who doesn't want you there. And that night I learned for certain I wasn't welcome there anymore. I had never been the type of person who wanted to live in the countryside, but after years of city noise, long hours, and constant traffic, I thought I needed a break. In the summer of 2014, when I was 33, I decided to rent a small cabin in the hills of northern Arkansas for a couple of months. It was advertised as quiet, private, and far away from neighbors. That was exactly what I thought I wanted. I didn't care that it was old or that the road leading up to it was barely a road at all. Solitude felt like the cure to everything I had been carrying on my shoulders. The cabin was about an hour outside of the nearest town, a place where gas stations doubled as grocery stores and where you didn't see more than 3 cars on the same stretch of road. To reach the cabin, I had to drive up a winding dirt path that looked like it hadn't been graded in years. Gravel crunched under my tires, and every few hundred feet, my car jolted over dips that looked like dried-up ruts from storms. Trees leaned close on either side, their branches sometimes scraping against the car doors as I made my way up. When I first stepped out, the air felt different, heavier, quieter. No horns, no sirens, no neighbors slamming doors or shouting on their phones. Just the drone of insects, the rustle of leaves, and a faint breeze that carried the smell of damp soil and pine. The cabin sat back off the path in a small clearing, its wood faded gray and the roof patched in a couple of spots with tin. It wasn't pretty, but it looked solid enough. Inside, it was simple. A single main room with a bed against the wall, a wood stove, an old couch, and a small kitchen that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 70s. The bathroom was just a corner with a sink, toilet, and a stand-up shower stall. The windows were single pane, the kind that rattled when the wind blew. I thought it was charming in a way, like stepping into another time. The first few nights were uneventful. I spent the evenings reading, cooking simple meals, and sitting out on the small porch with a beer while the sky turned dark. Nights out there felt heavy. The darkness was unlike anything in the city, thick and absolute. When I turned off the porch light, I couldn't see more than a few feet in front of me. The forest seemed to press in closer, and every sound carried sharper in that silence. The hoot of an owl, the snapping of a branch, the faint skittering of something moving low through the grass. By the 5th night, I started noticing little things. At first, it was just a feeling, the kind that makes the back of your neck prickle. I'd be inside reading and suddenly stop, thinking I had heard something outside. Not close, not right against the cabin, but faint. The sound of movement, maybe someone stepping where they shouldn't. When I went to the window, all I saw was blackness and the faint outline of the trees. I told myself it was just animals. Out there were deer, raccoons, and coyotes. Nothing unusual about hearing them moving around. But the feeling didn't go away. One night, as I was lying in bed, I thought I heard gravel crunching up the road. The same sound my car made when I had arrived. It was distant at first, then seemed to stop. I sat up, heart beating hard in my chest, straining to listen. For several minutes, there was nothing, just the low whistle of wind against the cabin walls. I finally lay back down, but sleep didn't come easy. The next morning, I walked out to where the dirt path curved toward the cabin. I expected to see nothing, but in the soft soil just off the gravel, I noticed prints. They weren't clear enough to tell exactly what made them, but they were too big to be from a raccoon or a fox, and the spacing looked wrong for a deer. It looked like someone had walked along the side of the road, just close enough to stay out of sight. I tried to shake it off. People hunted in those woods, and maybe someone had just wandered through during the night. Still, the idea of someone walking so close to the cabin without coming up to knock didn't sit right with me. The days passed slowly. I kept finding myself glancing out the windows more often, checking the tree line, watching for movement. At night, I started keeping the porch light on, even when I went to bed. It didn't push back much of the dark, but it gave me a little comfort. Then came the night that broke whatever calm I had left. It was around midnight when I woke to a sound, soft but sharp enough to cut through my sleep. The creak of the porch boards. My stomach dropped instantly. I lay frozen, staring at the ceiling, every muscle tight. Then it came again, slow, deliberate. Someone was out there, walking across the porch, just feet away from where I lay. I forced myself to sit up, moving as quietly as I could. The old bed frame groaned under me, and I winced, holding my breath. I glanced toward the window, but the porch light had been switched off. My hand trembled as I realized I hadn't turned it off myself before going to bed. I stood there in the dark cabin, barely breathing, listening. Whoever it was didn't knock, didn't say anything. Just slow, measured steps across the wood. Then silence. I stayed that way for what felt like hours, not daring to move. Eventually, I slid down onto the floor beside the bed, keeping low, and waited until the first light of dawn crept through the trees. When I finally worked up the courage to open the door, the porch was empty. The only sign that something had been there was the faint smear of mud on one of the boards near the steps. It wasn't an animal print. It was the heel of a boot. That was enough for me. I spent the entire morning packing my things, stuffing clothes into bags, gathering up food, and making sure I hadn't left anything behind. Every few minutes, I stopped to look out the window, certain I was being watched. The forest felt different in the daylight, but that didn't ease the weight in my chest. By noon, I had everything in the car. As I pulled away, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror at the cabin shrinking behind me. The trees swallowed it quickly, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone stood just out of sight, watching me leave. I didn't stop until I reached the town an hour away. At the gas station, I sat in the car for a long time, letting the air conditioner run while I tried to steady my hands. I didn't call the sheriff. I didn't report anything. What could I have said? That I heard footsteps, saw some prints, and got scared? They probably would have told me it was a hunter or a drifter passing through. Maybe that's all it was. But the way those steps had sounded slow, steady, unhurried, made it feel like whoever it was had all the time in the world. Like they wanted me to know they were there. I never went back to that cabin. I never even asked for the refund I technically was owed for leaving early. Some things aren't worth holding on to, and that silence out there in the countryside, the one I thought I wanted so badly, has never sounded peaceful to me since. I was 29 the first time I came across the old cabin. It was the fall of 1997, and I had just moved to northern Maine for work. I rented a small place outside of Millinocket, close to the edge of the woods. Most days I worked at the paper mill, but on weekends I liked to hike into the forest, just to get away from the noise and see what was out there. The woods in Maine are thick and endless, stretching for miles without roads or houses. And when you're out there alone, the silence feels heavy. One Sunday in late October, I set out earlier than usual. The sky was overcast, the air sharp and damp with that smell of wet leaves. I carried a small backpack with a thermos of coffee, a flashlight, and a folding knife I always kept on me. I followed an old logging trail that wound deep into the trees. After about 2 hours of walking, I noticed something odd through the branches. Something straight, something man-made. At first I thought it was just a hunting blind or maybe an old shed. But when I pushed closer, I saw it was a cabin. It stood in a small clearing, surrounded by birch and pine, half hidden behind overgrowth. The roof sagged under years of snow and rain, and the wood was gray, almost black in spots from rot. One of the shutters hung off on a single hinge, swaying slightly in the breeze. I froze for a moment, just taking it in. I hadn't expected to find a building this far from town. The place looked abandoned for decades. Still, something about it drew me forward. I stepped carefully through the leaves, my boots crunching in the silence, and stood at the door. The handle was rusted metal, cold to the touch. When I pulled, it gave way with a groan, the door scraping across the warped floor. The air inside was heavy, stale, like damp wood and old earth. Dust floated in the weak light that came through the broken window. The floorboards creaked under my weight. Against one wall stood a narrow bed frame, the mattress torn open and spilling yellowed stuffing. In the corner, a wood stove sat rusting, its pipe bent where it connected to the ceiling. Shelves hung crooked, and on them lay glass jars cloudy with age, some still holding dried contents that looked like beans or rice. I moved slowly, trying not to breathe too much of the thick air. The place looked untouched, but it also looked wrong, like whoever had lived there had left in a hurry. A chair was tipped over in the center of the room. Near the stove, a pair of boots sat neatly side by side, coated in dust. On the table lay an old hunting knife, its blade dark with rust, and next to it, a cracked enamel mug. I walked around, scanning the walls and floor. In one corner, near the bed, I noticed scratches in the wood. They were faint, almost worn away, but they looked like someone had dragged something heavy across the boards more than once. I knelt down and ran my hand over them. The grooves were deep, not the kind an animal would leave. As I stood again, I felt that strange tightness in my chest that comes when you know you're somewhere you shouldn't be. The cabin was silent, but it wasn't peaceful. It felt like the air itself was pressing against me. In the back of the cabin, a door leaned slightly open. I pushed it and found a smaller room, maybe used for storage. The smell here was stronger, like mildew and something else I couldn't place. Shelves lined the walls, and on them were glass jars filled with murky liquid. Whatever had been inside them was long gone to rot, just dark shapes floating at the bottom. The floor was littered with old rags, brittle with age. I didn't stay in that room long. I backed out, my eyes flicking around the cabin again. Then I noticed something I had missed before. Near the far wall, behind the tipped-over chair, there was a square cut into the floor. A trapdoor. The metal ring handle was still attached, faintly orange with rust. I stood there for a while, staring at it. My instincts told me not to touch it, but curiosity got the better of me. I knelt, hooked my fingers under the ring, and pulled. The wood groaned as it lifted. A dark hole opened beneath me, the smell of earth and mold rushing up. I switched on my flashlight and pointed it down. Wooden steps led into a narrow crawl space, maybe a root cellar. The light caught dirt walls, uneven and damp, and what looked like shelves carved right into the earth. For some reason, I climbed down. The steps bowed under my weight, threatening to snap, but they held. At the bottom, the space was barely tall enough to stand. The air was colder here, the smell heavier. On the shelves were more jars, some broken, shards of glass crunching under my boots. In the dirt floor, I saw something strange, deep impressions almost like holes dug by hand. Then my light hit the far wall, and I froze. There were scratches all over it, long gouges in the dirt, as if someone had clawed at it from the inside. I stood there, the beam of my flashlight trembling slightly in my hand, trying to make sense of it. The longer I looked, the more unsettled I felt. I backed up slowly, climbing the steps, my shoulders brushing the dirt walls. When I came out into the cabin again, I slammed the trapdoor shut and just stood there, my pulse thudding in my ears. The air felt heavier now. My skin prickled, the hairs on my neck stiff. I realized how far I was from town, how nobody knew I was out here. The thought of staying even another minute in that cabin made my stomach turn. I left the door swinging open behind me and walked fast through the clearing back into the woods. The hike back felt longer than the way in. Every crack of a branch made me jerk my head, scanning the trees. The silence wasn't the same anymore. It wasn't calm. It was like the woods were holding their breath. By the time I reached the logging trail, my legs ached and my throat was dry. I didn't stop until I saw the road where I had parked my truck. Only then did I let myself breathe, sitting behind the wheel with the doors locked, staring down the trail I had just come from. I didn't tell anyone about the cabin. Not then, not for years. But the image of it stayed with me. The scratches on the floor, the jars in the cellar, the gouged dirt wall. Whoever had lived there had been storing more than food, and whatever happened in that place, it wasn't the kind of story you hear in town over a drink. I never went back. Every time I thought about it, my chest tightened the same way it had inside those walls. It wasn't fear of ghosts or legends. It was the kind of fear that comes when you realize people can do worse things than you ever imagine. And out there in the woods, far from anyone, no one would ever know. The cabin is still there. I'm sure of it, sinking deeper into the trees with each year that passes. But I learned that day there are places better left untouched, places that hold memories you don't want to wake up. And the woods of Maine are wide enough to hide them forever. I had been driving for hours through the winding back roads of northern Pennsylvania when I finally reached the old hunting cabin. It sat tucked deep into the trees, about a mile off a narrow dirt road, the kind of place you wouldn't find unless someone pointed you there. The cabin had belonged to an old friend of my father's, a man who had long since passed away. I was told I could use it if I ever wanted to get away from everything, and after a rough few weeks at work, I figured it would be a good escape. The cabin looked exactly like what you'd expect. Weathered with siding, a sagging porch, a rusty metal roof that had lost its shine decades ago. The forest pressed right up against it, thick oaks and maples with branches so dense they blocked out most of the evening light. By the time I parked my truck and unloaded my bag, the woods had already gone quiet in that heavy, unsettling way they sometimes do. No birds, no wind, nothing. Inside smelled of old wood and dust. The air was cool and still. There was no electricity, no plumbing, just a hand pump outside for water and a fireplace for heat. The furniture was worn but usable. A narrow bed with a thin mattress, a small table, 2 chairs, and an old cabinet with its hinges starting to rust. I set my stuff down and struck a few matches to light the oil lanterns I had brought. Their faint glow made the place feel less empty, but it didn't get rid of the uneasy feeling in my gut. I told myself it was just nerves. I wasn't used to being this far from anyone. The closest town was 30 minutes away, and even that wasn't much. Just a gas station, a diner, and a few scattered houses. No neighbors out here, no cell service, nothing but me and the woods. I tried to embrace the quiet, convincing myself that was the whole point of the trip. That first night, I barely slept. The forest outside seemed alive with sounds that felt louder than they should have. Sticks snapping, something moving through the brush, the faint scrape of claws or nails against wood. I lay still in the bed, my body tense, telling myself it was just raccoons or deer, but it never seemed to stop. Every time I drifted close to sleep, another noise would jolt me awake again. In the morning, I walked around outside the cabin. The ground was damp from dew, the air sharp with the smell of pine. I saw prints in the dirt near the porch. At first, I thought they were from a dog, but the more I looked, the more wrong they seemed. They were spread wide apart, deeper than I expected, as if whatever made them was heavy. They circled around the cabin once and then disappeared into the trees. I tried not to think too much about it, telling myself again it was just a stray dog from some farm a few miles away. The day passed slowly. I hiked a bit, read from a book I'd brought, tried to relax. But even in the daylight, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time I stopped moving, the woods went too quiet, as if something had gone still at the same time. My skin prickled, my stomach tight. I wanted to believe it was my imagination, but it didn't feel like that. By the second night, my nerves were worse. I kept the lantern burning longer than I should have, knowing I was wasting fuel. Every creak of the old wood, every gust of wind, made me snap my head toward the door. Around midnight, I heard footsteps on the porch. Slow, deliberate steps, not an animal scurrying, but weight pressing into the boards. My chest tightened. I stared at the door, waiting for the handle to move, waiting for a knock, waiting for something. But after a few minutes, the sound stopped. I didn't sleep after that. I just sat on the bed with my hunting knife clutched in my hand, ears straining for the slightest sound. By the time daylight finally broke through the cracks in the walls, I felt sick with exhaustion. When I went outside, the ground by the porch told the story I was dreading. There were prints again, bigger and clearer this time. They weren't dog prints. They weren't anything I could place exactly, but they were wrong. Too long, too wide, pressed too deep. I followed them for a while until they vanished into the undergrowth. Every step I took into those woods made me feel exposed, so I turned back before I went too far. I spent the rest of the day restless, debating whether I should pack up and leave. But part of me didn't want to seem like I was running from nothing. I told myself it was just a trespasser, some local wandering around, maybe a hunter, maybe even just kids messing around. The idea didn't sit right, but I clung to it anyway. That night was worse than the others. The noises came back, louder and closer. Something circled the cabin, breaking twigs, brushing against the walls. I held my knife and sat by the window, lantern dimmed low. At one point, I saw movement in the trees. A figure, tall and thin, just at the edge of the lantern glow. It didn't move like an animal, and it didn't look like any person I had ever seen. It stood there for a long time, motionless, watching. My hands were sweating so bad I almost dropped the knife. I wanted to believe it was just a trick of the light, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. I stayed frozen in place, heart hammering in my chest, until it finally slipped back into the woods. When the sun came up, I made my decision. I wasn't staying another night. Whatever that thing was, whatever had been out there, it wasn't safe to be alone anymore. I packed my bag fast, tossing everything in without caring how it fit. When I stepped onto the porch, I felt eyes on me again, though I didn't see anything. The woods were dead silent, the air heavy. I kept my head down and walked to the truck, my throat dry, every step feeling like it was dragging me deeper into something I didn't want to understand. The truck started on the first turn, and I didn't waste a second. I sped down the dirt path, rocks kicking up behind me, not daring to look in the mirrors. By the time I reached the main road, my hands were shaking so bad I could barely hold the wheel. I drove until I hit town, parked in the gas station lot, and just sat there for almost an hour trying to calm down. I never went back to that cabin. I never even thought about it without my stomach twisting. I don't know what I saw out there. I don't want to know. But I do know this. Something was watching me those nights, something that wanted me gone, and I was smart enough to leave before it decided to do more than watch. That's the only reason I'm here to tell it. It was the autumn of 1996 when I rented a small cabin on the edge of the Peak District in Derbyshire. I was 27 at the time, and I'd been working in Manchester, caught up in the routine noise and the constant feeling of being boxed in. I'd taken a week off, telling myself I needed to breathe somewhere far away from motorways, offices, and city air. A friend of a friend told me about a cabin they'd stayed in, cheap, quiet, and tucked at the end of a track that ran off a narrow country road. That was all I wanted. I didn't care if it was plain. Peace was enough. When I first arrived, it looked better than I expected. The cabin was wooden, stained dark by years of rain, with moss climbing up the side near the stone chimney. Behind it stretched hills covered in heather, and in front, about 50 yards away, sat a line of trees that looked almost black as the daylight faded. The place was simple inside. One small bedroom, a kitchen with an old electric stove, a living space with a sofa and a table, and a bathroom with a tiny water heater that I had to switch on every evening. Felt old, but not abandoned. Dust clung in corners, but the sheets were clean, and the power worked. I unpacked, lit a cigarette by the open window, and told myself I was going to sleep better than I had in months. The first 2 days were uneventful. I walked the trails, cooked basic meals, and spent long hours reading. I didn't see a single person once I left the main road. The weather was cool and cloudy, the kind of air that smells wet even before the rain comes. Suited me. By the third night, I had gotten used to the quiet, though the silence after sunset felt heavy in a way city silence never does. In Manchester, there's always a hum. Distant traffic, late-night voices, or music. Here, when the wind stopped, it was so still that I could hear my own heart if I lay awake. On the fourth evening, something unsettled me. I'd gone out just before dusk to gather some firewood from a pile left near the treeline. As I bent down to pick up the smaller pieces, I noticed someone standing between the trees. At first, I thought it was just a darker shape among the shadows, but then the outline sharpened. It was a woman. She was standing very still, half turned toward me. Her clothes looked wrong, like they belonged to another time. Long skirt, a coat that seemed too heavy for walking. Her hair was dark and stringy, hanging forward on one side. She didn't move. She didn't call out. She just stood there. I straightened up, holding the wood, my hands stiff. For a long moment, I waited for her to wave or step forward, to say she was walking through. But she didn't. She just looked, head slightly tilted, as though she was trying to make me out from a distance. I couldn't see her face clearly, only the pale skin against the dark of her clothes. The silence pressed harder then. No bird sounds, no rustling, nothing. I carried the wood inside, trying not to turn my back fully on the trees, though I had to eventually. Once inside, I locked the door. I told myself maybe she was just another visitor, someone who'd strayed onto the land. But it didn't sit right. The way she stood, too rigid, too long. Not even a shift of weight from one foot to the other. When I checked again from the window, she was gone. That night, I barely slept. Every creak of the old wood, every gust of wind against the cabin made me freeze. I kept thinking about her standing so still, as if she wasn't lost or looking for anyone, but as if she was waiting. The next day, I forced myself outside to prove it was nothing. The tracks by the trees were soft from rain, but I didn't see footprints. I walked further, into the line of trees, and found nothing. Just damp leaves, branches, and the smell of wet earth. Still, the air felt heavy, like I was trespassing. I didn't stay long. That evening, around the same time, I heard something outside. It was faint at first, what sounded like a footstep on gravel, slow and dragging. I turned off the light, heart racing, and went to the window. At first, I saw only the dim outline of the yard, but then, near the corner of the cabin, I caught sight of her again. The same long coat, the same hair. She was closer now, only a few feet from the wall. She wasn't facing me. She was turned toward the woodpile, standing at an angle as if she had been caught mid-step. I stayed frozen, not daring to move the curtain too far. She stood there for what felt like minutes. Then, without any sound, she walked slowly back toward the trees. The steps were too soft, too deliberate. I didn't open the door. I didn't breathe until she vanished into the black line of woods. The following day, I considered leaving. My rental was paid through the week, and it felt foolish to cut it short. I tried to reason with myself. Maybe it was a local woman, someone who lived nearby, although I hadn't seen a house for miles on the road in. Maybe she was harmless, but something in me resisted that thought. There was no reason for her to be standing that close to the cabin, not 2 nights in a row, and no reason to watch me without a word. On the 6th night, I made a mistake. I left the window in the bedroom slightly open because the air inside was stuffy from the fire. I lay awake longer than usual, listening. Around midnight, I heard the faintest sound of gravel again, slower this time. My body went cold instantly. I didn't move, just listened. The sound came closer, a few feet at a time, stopping, starting again. Then silence. Couldn't stand it. I sat up, turned my head toward the window, and that's when I saw her. She was outside, almost level with the glass, her face just visible in the dark. Her skin was pale, her eyes shadowed, and strands of hair clung to her cheeks. She was staring straight in, not moving, not blinking. My chest locked up. For a long moment, I couldn't even breathe. I pulled the curtain across in one sharp move and backed against the opposite wall. I didn't sleep at all after that. I sat in the chair until daylight, every muscle tight, staring at the door. When the sun finally came through, I packed my things as fast as I could. Leaving the cabin that morning, I checked the ground outside the bedroom window. The damp soil was pressed down in places where someone had stood. Clear prints, small but deep, leading back toward the woods. I drove away without looking back. The whole way down the winding road, my hands shook on the wheel. When I returned the key, I didn't mention what I'd seen. I didn't even ask who owned the land. I just left it behind. It's been nearly 30 years since then, and I've never gone back to that area. Whenever people talk about renting cabins in the countryside, I keep my mouth shut. But I still remember her face through that window. The way she didn't flinch or move, just stared as if she had been standing there all night, waiting for me to notice. I don't know who she was or what she wanted, but I know this much. She wasn't lost and she wasn't passing through. She had come there for a reason, and I was the one she chose to watch. It was late autumn in 1998 when I decided to stay for a few weeks at my uncle's old farm in southern Missouri. I was 26 then, still working odd jobs, and I thought the quiet out there would help me clear my head. The farm had been empty for a while since he moved into town, but the small cabin that sat near the edge of the property was still in decent shape. It was an old wooden place with a tin roof, a front porch that looked out over the cornfields, and a narrow dirt road leading up to it. The first night was calm. The air smelled of damp soil and dry leaves, and the wind moved through the cornstalks with a steady rustling sound that never really stopped. I had a small oil heater inside the cabin and a single lamp that lit the living room. The floorboards creaked under every step, and there were places where the wood had splintered with age. Mice scratched in the walls now and then, but nothing about it felt threatening. It was just an old farm cabin, quiet, lonely, and tucked away. The days were uneventful at first. I spent most mornings walking the land, checking the fence lines, and just exploring the wide fields. The place stretched far, with patches of woods breaking up the cornfields, and a creek running cold and shallow behind the cabin. There were barns too, though they were half collapsed, roofs caved in from years of neglect. The whole property had that look of being forgotten, where nature was slowly taking it back. By the fourth night, I started to notice things I couldn't explain away so easily. It was just before midnight when I heard footsteps outside on the porch. They were heavy, dragging sounds like someone was slowly pacing. At first I thought maybe it was an animal, but the boards groaned under the weight, and animals didn't usually walk in such a steady rhythm. I sat still in the dark, listening, every muscle tight. The steps went from one side of the porch to the other, then stopped. I waited, but there was nothing else. No knock, no voice, just silence and the wind in the fields. After maybe an hour of holding my breath, I finally lay back down, telling myself it had to be my imagination mixed with the sounds of the old wood. The next morning, I stepped outside to check. The dirt around the porch was soft from rain the day before, That's when I noticed the prints. They weren't boots or shoes. They were bare feet, long, narrow, and sunk deep into the mud like whoever left them was heavy. They circled the cabin, stopping by the windows before moving back toward the fields. My stomach turned cold as I followed them for a while, but they faded into the corn rows and disappeared. I spent the day uneasy, checking the locks on the doors and windows over and over. The cabin only had 2 doors, front and back, both old but sturdy. The windows had latches, though some of the glass panes rattled loose when the wind hit. I didn't tell anyone about the footprints, partly because I had no one nearby to tell and partly because I didn't want to sound paranoid. That night, the sounds came back. It wasn't just footsteps this time, it was scratching. Slow, dragging scratches along the wood of the cabin walls. Sometimes it came from near the floor, other times from higher up by the windows. I sat in the dark again, this time with a hammer in my hand, my throat dry, my ears straining for every sound. The scratching went on for hours, stopping and starting, moving from one side of the cabin to the other. I barely slept. By the 6th day, I hadn't had more than a few broken hours of rest, and my nerves were shot. I kept noticing little things inside the cabin moved around. A chair would be slightly off from where I left it, or the curtain by the back window would be pulled open when I was sure I had closed it. At first I thought maybe I was forgetting, but after a while it was too much to ignore. Something or someone was watching the cabin, maybe even slipping inside when I wasn't aware. I started keeping all the curtains shut and staying close to the heater in the center of the room, where I could see both doors at once. The nights dragged by. The noises outside got louder, like whoever was out there didn't care if I heard anymore. I'd wake to the sound of breathing outside the window, heavy and slow, only a few inches of glass between us. The prints in the mud grew more frequent, circling again and again. One morning, just before sunrise, I walked out to the creek to splash my face with water and try to wake myself up. That's when I saw it across the field. A figure, standing at the edge of the corn, just barely visible in the gray light. It was tall, its posture off, with its shoulders hunched forward and its arms hanging too long at its sides. I froze, watching. It didn't move for the longest time, and then it stepped back into the corn and disappeared. My chest felt hollow. I didn't go after it, I couldn't. I turned and walked back to the cabin as calmly as I could. But inside I was shaking so bad I could barely lock the door again. The next few nights were unbearable. I hardly ate, barely slept. Every creak of the cabin felt like a warning. I kept thinking about how far I was from town, how long it would take for anyone to reach me if something happened. On the 8th night, the worst of it came. I had finally dozed off in the chair when I woke to the sound of the back door handle turning. It was slow, deliberate. The old metal squeaked as the handle twisted, and then the wood of the door rattled like someone was pushing against it. My whole body locked up. The door didn't give, but the pressure stayed for what felt like minutes. Then it stopped. Silence again. I sat there until daylight, clutching the hammer, my eyes on that door. When the sun finally came up, I opened it carefully to check. The prints were back in the mud, right at the threshold this time, bare feet pressed deep, toes pointed inward toward the cabin. That was it. I packed my things as fast as I could. I left the heater cold, the lamp still on, the curtains drawn tight, and I drove down that dirt road without looking back. I never stayed in that cabin again. My uncle sold the property a year later, and I didn't ask who bought it. I didn't want to know. Even now, years later, I think about those prints, the sound of the handle turning, and the figure in the field. Whoever or whatever, it wasn't just passing by. It knew I was there. It had been watching me the whole time, and I left before it decided to come inside. I had rented the cabin for a week, mostly to get away from the noise of the city. It was September of 2014, and I was 31 then, working long hours in construction. My body felt worn down, my head always buzzing with the grind of traffic and schedules. A coworker had mentioned a small hunting cabin outside of Ashland, Wisconsin, tucked back on a private piece of land about half a mile from the main dirt road. He said it was simple, nothing fancy, but quiet. That was all I needed. When I pulled up, the place looked exactly like I had imagined. Weathered with siding, a tin roof streaked with rust, and a single porch that sagged slightly in the middle. The grass around it was knee-high, except for the thin tracks of dirt where the owner's truck must have passed through earlier in the summer. There was no one around for miles. The trees pressed close from every direction, tall pines and birches blocking most of the sky. Felt shut off like stepping into another time. Inside was even simpler. A small wood stove, a table with 2 chairs, a sagging couch, and a cot tucked against the wall. There was no electricity, no running water, just a hand pump outside and a stack of firewood piled under a tarp. The floorboards creaked with every step. It smelled of pine, dust, and old smoke. I set my bag down on the cot, cracked a beer I had brought, and told myself this would be a good reset. No phone, no lights, no noise but the wind. The first night was uneventful. I cooked some canned beans on the stove, drank a couple more beers, and listened to the crickets outside. The air got cold quickly, and I had to get the stove going just to keep the chill off. I fell asleep early, wrapped in a blanket, the fire popping softly in the corner. The second day I spent walking the land. There was an old deer stand about 200 yards from the cabin, nailed into a crooked tree, half rotted but still holding. I followed a game trail deeper into the woods until I found a small stream. The water was cold and clear, and I cupped it into my hands to drink. Tasted clean, better than anything bottled. I sat there a while, watching the light filter through the branches, thinking about how long it had been since I had been truly alone. It was later that afternoon when I first noticed something off. I had gone back to the cabin, started chopping some wood, when I saw it boot prints in the dirt near the side of the cabin. They weren't mine. I could tell because they were smaller, maybe a size 8 or 9, and the tread was different. I wore heavy steel-toe boots for work, and these were thinner, the kind you might buy at a big box store. The ground was soft from rain the day before, so the prints looked fresh. At first, I told myself maybe the owner had been out here recently and walked around. But the tracks circled the cabin, looping toward the back door and then off into the trees. I stood there for a long minute, axe in hand, staring at the prints. The woods around me were quiet, too quiet. Eventually, I forced myself to go back inside, but the unease stayed with me the rest of the evening. That night, I couldn't sleep as easily. The cabin creaked and popped like old wood does, but every sound felt sharper. I lay in the dark listening, ears straining for something beyond the wind. At some point, I must have drifted off, because I woke up with the faintest noise outside the window. It wasn't an animal rustling. It was slower, deliberate, like footsteps on the grass. My chest tightened, and I stayed perfectly still, my eyes fixed on the shadowy shape of the window. I didn't move until dawn. When I finally worked up the courage to step outside, I saw more tracks. Fresh ones, leading right up to the window beside my cot. Whoever it was had stood there, close enough to see me sleeping inside. The prints then turned and disappeared into the woods. My first thought was to pack up and leave, but something in me resisted. I didn't want to feel run off like some trespasser could just scare me out of a place I had rented fair and square. So I stayed, but I changed how I moved. I kept my axe close, and I started locking the cabin door with the rusty padlock the owner had left on the latch. At night, I wedged a chair under the handle from the inside. The third night was the worst. I had just settled in, fire glowing low, when I heard it again. Steps outside, slower this time, circling. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might echo through the wood. I picked up the axe and stood in the dark, barely breathing. The steps stopped near the porch. I could hear the wood creak like someone had put their weight on it. Then nothing, just silence so deep it roared in my ears. I didn't sleep at all that night. At dawn, I opened the door cautiously. The dirt around the porch was full of tracks, the same tread as before, and now I could see something else. A cigarette but ground into the dirt, still fresh, still smelling of smoke. Whoever it was hadn't just passed by. They had stood there smoking, watching. That was when I decided I was done. I packed my bag quickly, shoved everything into the truck, and took one last look at the cabin. The woods around it looked calm, but I couldn't shake the thought of eyes watching me from behind the trees. I drove fast down that dirt track, my hands tight on the wheel, checking the mirror every few seconds. Back in town, I returned the key to the coworker who had told me about the place. I didn't explain much, just said the cabin wasn't for me. Later, when I was home in my apartment with the city noise filtering through the windows, I finally let myself process it. Someone had been out there. Not once, not by accident, but 3 nights in a row. They had circled the cabin, come right up to the window, stood on the porch. They weren't lost. They weren't curious hikers. They knew I was there and they wanted me to know it too. I never went back. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I had stayed one more night. Maybe nothing. Maybe everything. All I know is those woods felt wrong after that, like they belonged to someone else. Someone who didn't want me there. I was 29 the year it happened. It was late October 2012 when I decided to get away for a few weeks. I had been working too many hours in the city and needed to clear my head. A friend of mine from college had a small cabin he used for hunting trips, tucked deep in the woods of northern New Mexico. He wasn't using it that season, so he told me I could have it to myself. I drove down in my old pickup, loaded with food, a couple jugs of water, a rifle, and enough supplies to last a good while. The drive itself was quiet. Once I left the highway and followed the dirt road for nearly an hour, I didn't see another car. The land flattened out into wide plains, then rose up again into thick pines that stretched for miles. The cabin was hidden just beyond a clearing. It wasn't much, just one room, a wood stove in the corner, a narrow bed, and a small table, but it felt like freedom to me. No phone signal, no noise from the city, no one around for miles. The first few days passed without issue. I chopped firewood, hiked, and spent hours sitting on the porch listening to the forest. At night, the stars felt endless, but the silence of the woods had a way of pressing on me the longer I stayed. By the 4th night, I started noticing little things that put me on edge. That evening, just as I was locking the door before bed, I heard movement in the clearing. At first, I thought it was a deer, branches snapping, the sound of something shifting its weight. But the noise wasn't steady. It stopped and started again, almost like whatever it was wanted me to know it was there. I stood by the window for a while, staring into the dark. I couldn't see anything, but I had the clear feeling that something was watching me. The next morning, I checked the ground outside. There were tracks, but they weren't clean prints. They looked half washed out, as if something heavy had been moving back and forth. Some looked like boot prints, others like paw prints, but none were clear enough to be certain. I told myself it was probably just coyotes circling at night, but the sight left a knot in my stomach. The days grew shorter and colder. On the 7th night, the sounds came back. This time, they circled the cabin. Slow, deliberate footsteps in the brush. Sometimes close enough that I swore I could hear breathing outside the walls. I sat on the bed with the rifle across my lap, every nerve awake, eyes fixed on the door. The noises went on for hours. When they finally stopped, the silence felt even worse. The next morning, I noticed something that made my skin crawl. Near the tree line, There were long drag marks in the dirt, as if something had been pulled across the ground. They stretched from the clearing into the forest, vanishing into the undergrowth. I stood there staring at them for a long time, my mind racing through possibilities. Maybe hunters, maybe animals fighting, but nothing fit right. I told myself I was being paranoid. Still, I started keeping the rifle closer, even during the day. I limited my hikes to the area near the cabin. I stopped sitting out on the porch after dark. The worst night came about a week later. The wind had picked up, shaking the trees, whistling through the cracks in the cabin walls. I had just put more wood in the stove when I heard it, something calling from the tree-line. It wasn't a coyote's yip or the cry of an owl. It was something that tried to sound human, but it was wrong. The voice carried in a broken way, drawn out, uneven, almost like someone who hadn't used their vocal cords in years. Called again, closer. The sound of my name. I froze, every hair on my body standing up. No one knew I was there. No one should have been within miles of that cabin. But there it was, a voice dragging my name through the dark. I didn't move for what felt like hours. The sound came again, circling, always from a different direction. Sometimes close, sometimes far. The forest felt alive with it. I sat against the wall, rifle shaking in my hands, sweat running down my neck even though the cabin was cold. At some point, the voice stopped, but the silence that followed was worse. I could hear something moving just outside the door. Slow, steady steps on the porch. The weight of it made the old boards creak. I aimed the rifle at the door, finger tight on the trigger, and waited. The steps went on for what felt like forever, back and forth. Then a long pause, then a scratching sound along the wood, like nails dragging across it. My chest felt like it was going to explode. I wanted to run, but where? Out into the woods, into whatever that thing was. I stayed locked in like that until the first light of morning crept through the cracks. The moment the sun touched the trees, the noises stopped. When I opened the door, there was nothing on the porch, but in the dirt just below the steps were prints, huge, misshapen, wrong. Some looked like barefoot tracks, but stretched long, the toes too thin, the arch too deep. They circled the cabin, leading back toward the trees. I knew then that I couldn't stay another night. I packed my things in a rush, loaded the truck, and drove out without looking back. The whole drive down the dirt road, I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something following. When I got back to the city, I told no one the full story. I said the trip was fine, that it was quiet, that I got some rest. But the truth has stayed with me ever since. I don't know what I heard or what walked outside that cabin, but I know it was real. Too real to be anything imagined. Even now, years later, I sometimes wake in the middle of the night, convinced I can hear it again. The sound of my name, dragged low and broken, slipping in from the dark. And I know, without doubt, that whatever it was is still out there. I had been working as a seasonal park ranger in northern Montana back in 2009. I was 27 years old at the time and had taken the job mostly because it paid well for the season and offered me free lodging. They put me up in a small cabin about 5 miles away from the ranger station, tucked deeper into the forest near a lake that was rarely visited. The cabin had been built back in the 60s, simple and weathered, nothing fancy. It had a tin roof that rattled when the wind blew hard, a single propane stove, a cot, and a desk pushed against the window. The only running water came from a hand pump outside, and there was an outhouse about 20 yards away. It wasn't a place you stayed if you wanted comfort, but it was fine for me. The first few weeks went by easy enough. My days were filled with trail inspections, clearing fallen branches, checking fire danger levels, and making sure campers had the right permits. I carried a radio, but out at the cabin, the signal was weak. At night, the forest felt enormous, pressing in from all sides, with the sounds of owls, coyotes, and the occasional snap of a branch that made me sit up straight in bed. I wasn't scared of the woods. I grew up hunting and fishing, but I knew enough to respect how empty and dangerous they could get. It was early October when things started to feel off. The air had turned colder, and the forest floor was damp with fallen leaves. That week, I noticed small things around the cabin that didn't sit right with me. One morning, I found the pump handle on the water spigot left pulled down, dripping slowly. I always let it snap back up after filling a bucket, but I figured I must have been tired and forgot. Another time, I came back from patrol and found my axe, which I kept buried in a stump outside, lying flat on the ground a few feet away. First, I shrugged it off. Out there, you get in your head easily. You start imagining mistakes you didn't make. But then the incidents piled up. One night, I woke up around 2 in the morning to the sound of the cabin's screen door creaking. I froze in bed. The door always made that noise when it was pulled open. I waited, holding my breath, staring into the dark ceiling, my ears straining. After a few seconds, it clicked shut again. I forced myself up and grabbed the flashlight I kept by my cot, sweeping the beam across the cabin. Everything looked normal. The lantern on the desk, the gear piled in the corner, my boots by the door. I told myself it must have been the wind, even though I'd latched the screen tight. The next morning, I walked a circle around the cabin. The soil was damp from overnight rain, perfect for catching tracks. First, I didn't see anything. Then I noticed a partial footprint pressed into the mud near the outhouse, the heel and half of the sole. It wasn't a boot print like mine. It looked like a regular shoe, worn down, narrow, about a size smaller than mine. It bothered me because no one had any business being out there. This wasn't a place people just wandered into. From that day forward, I started paying closer attention. I checked the ground every morning, looking for fresh impressions. A few times I thought I caught glimpses of movement through the trees when I hiked back to the cabin at dusk. A flash of dark clothing slipping behind trunks, vanishing before I could focus. I never heard footsteps, never saw a face, just movement. One evening, I was late getting back. The sun had dipped below the ridge, and the woods were soaked in that dim, gray light that makes every shadow stretch long. As I approached the cabin, my stomach sank. The front door was slightly open. I never left it that way. I stood still for a long time, listening. The forest was dead quiet except for a crow calling somewhere far off. I pulled my flashlight and pushed the door open. The inside smelled faintly different, like sweat that didn't belong to me. My gear was where I had left it, but my sleeping bag was unrolled, stretched flat across the cot instead of bundled up. The zipper was open halfway. I hadn't left it like that. I checked the corners of the cabin, every dark spot, even under the cot, my heart pounding the whole time. Nothing, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been in there, maybe not long before I returned. That night, I barely slept. Every crack of the wood settling made my skin crawl. I kept the flashlight in one hand and the hatchet in the other, my eyes darting to the door at every sound. At some point, exhaustion won, and I drifted off. When I woke, the lantern that I had left sitting upright on the desk was lying on its side on the floor. I decided to report it at the ranger station. I told my supervisor that I thought maybe some campers had strayed too close and were messing around near my cabin. He nodded, told me to keep an eye out, but didn't seem too worried. Out here, you either handled things yourself or waited for them to sort themselves out. I went back, uneasy but trying to convince myself it was nothing more than some local kids. 2 nights later, it escalated. I was lying awake, staring at the ceiling, when I heard slow, crunching footsteps outside, moving through the leaves. They circled the cabin once, deliberate and steady, then stopped near the back wall. I could hear faint breathing, like someone was leaning close. I gripped the hatchet so tight my hand ached. Then the footsteps moved again, fading into the woods. I didn't sleep at all after that. By morning, I had made up my mind. I didn't care what my supervisor said. I wasn't staying out there alone anymore. I packed my things in a hurry, stuffing gear into my backpack. Before I left, I walked one last lap around the cabin. Behind the structure, in the damp earth, was a clear set of footprints leading away into the trees. Same size as before, narrow, worn shoes. Whoever it was had been standing close enough to touch the back wall while I was inside. I hiked out fast, barely stopping to rest, my eyes flicking over my shoulder every few minutes. The whole time I felt watched, like whoever had been coming around the cabin was still out there, following me just far enough to stay unseen. When I finally reached the station, I told them everything. The footprints, the door, the footsteps at night. Another ranger went back with me later that week to check the cabin. We didn't find anyone, but there were more prints in the mud, leading off into the deeper woods. They looked fresh. I never stayed another night there. They reassigned me to a different cabin closer to the main road, and I didn't argue. A month later, when the season ended, I left Montana and never went back. To this day, I don't know who was out there. Maybe it was some drifter, maybe a local living off the grid, maybe someone with darker intentions. All I know is that cabin didn't feel like it belonged to me after that. It felt like I had been a guest in someone else's place the whole time, and they had finally decided to remind me of it. I was 36 the year I rented that small cabin in northern Minnesota. It was the fall of 2009, early October, when the trees were bright orange and red and the air carried that mix of cold mornings and warm afternoons. I had been working long hours in Minneapolis, and I thought a week away, completely alone, would clear my head. I didn't want company, no phone, no internet, no neighbors, just silence. The cabin was set back off an old county road, about 4 miles down a gravel track that was barely wide enough for my truck. It was the kind of place that didn't even show up right on maps. I had gotten the key through a friend of a friend. No rental website, no official listing. Just an address scribbled on paper and instructions to leave cash in an envelope on the counter when I left. I didn't think much of it at the time. The place was small. A single room with a bed, a wood stove, a table, and a short counter with a sink that only ran cold water from a hand pump. The bathroom was an outhouse about 20 yards back into the trees. There was no electricity, only a couple of gas lanterns and candles left behind. I had packed food in coolers and enough wood to get me through a week if I used it sparingly. The first 2 nights were quiet. During the day, I walked the trails behind the cabin, following deer tracks through the damp leaves. At night, I sat near the stove and read by lantern light. I remember thinking it was almost too quiet. You don't realize how much background noise you live with until it's gone. Out there, when the fire burned low, you could hear every creak of the cabin walls, every snap of a twig outside. On the 3rd night, I noticed something. I had walked about 3 miles out earlier that day, farther than I had gone before, and I spotted an old shed collapsed into itself. The roof was caved in, the boards rotting. I didn't go closer, just stood at the tree line and looked. For some reason it unsettled me, though I couldn't explain why. That night, as I tried to sleep, I kept thinking about it. It was just past midnight when I heard something move outside. At first, I thought it was a deer. The leaves crunched in slow, deliberate steps. I sat up in bed, listening. The steps circled the cabin once, then stopped at the far corner. I waited. My heart pounded so hard I could hear it in my ears. After a long stretch of silence, I convinced myself it was nothing more than a deer passing through, and I finally drifted back to sleep. The next morning, I found footprints in the soft dirt near the corner of the cabin. Not animal tracks. They were boot prints, heavy ones larger than mine. They came in from the trees, circled the cabin, and went back the same way. I tried to reason with myself. Maybe a hunter, maybe someone who lived nearby, but I hadn't seen another house in miles on the way in. I had no idea who would be out there walking around in the middle of the night. That day I couldn't focus. I kept glancing at the tree line, expecting to see someone standing there. I thought about packing up and leaving, but it felt foolish. I had come out here for peace and quiet. Maybe I was overreacting. By the afternoon, I had almost convinced myself to ignore it. But that night it happened again. I was dozing off when I heard the crunch of footsteps. This time slower, like whoever it was wanted me to hear. They moved back and forth along the front of the cabin, stopping every few seconds. My breathing grew shallow and I didn't move. I lay there in the dark, staring at the ceiling, every muscle tense. After about 10 minutes, the sound faded away into the woods. When the sun rose, I forced myself outside. The footprints were clearer this time, right there in the frost. They led straight to the front steps. Whoever it was had stood only a few feet from the door for a long time. Too long. I checked my truck. Nothing had been touched, but I still locked it, even though I was in the middle of nowhere. The only weapon I had was a hatchet I brought for splitting kindling. I kept it by my bed that night. Sleep didn't come easy. I lay awake, every creak of the wood stove making me flinch. Around 2 a.m., I heard something new. Not footsteps this time. Breathing. Slow, heavy breaths right outside the window near my bed. The glass was so thin I could almost feel it. I didn't dare move. I just gripped the hatchet handle and stared into the dark. The breathing lasted maybe a minute before it stopped. I couldn't bring myself to look out the window. When the morning came, I finally checked. The glass had smudges, like someone had pressed their face against it. That was it for me. I decided to leave that day. I packed everything into the truck fast, barely eating breakfast. I left the envelope with the cash on the table like I had been told, but I didn't care if they found it or not. I just wanted to get out of there. Driving down the gravel track, I kept checking the mirror, half expecting to see someone step out of the woods behind me. My hands shook on the wheel. When I finally reached the paved road, I pulled over and sat there for a while, letting the tension drain out. I looked at my phone, which had been off the whole time. Dozens of missed calls from my sister. I called her back. She told me there had been reports of break-ins in that area, cabins and hunting shacks ransacked while people were inside them sleeping. Nobody had been caught. I never went back to that cabin. I never even asked the friend who gave me the key about it. I didn't want to know who might have been out there with me those nights. All I know is that someone was, and they were too close. Since then, whenever I drive past a stretch of woods at night, I think about those smudges on the window and the sound of breathing in the dark, just inches from where I slept. I remember that night more clearly than I wish I did. It was October of 2012, and I had taken a week off from work to get away from people and spend some quiet time in the woods of northern Minnesota. I rented an old cabin that sat on the edge of a lake, tucked back off a dirt road about 5 miles from the nearest paved one. It wasn't much, 2 rooms, a small kitchen, and a wood stove, but it was enough for me and my dog, Max. He was a big shepherd mix, almost 10 years old, with more sense than most people I knew. The first couple of days passed quietly. I chopped wood, cooked on the little gas stove, and fished off the dock while Max patrolled the tree line like he was guarding something only he understood. The air was sharp and cool, the trees bare, and at night the kind of silence you only find that deep in the woods pressed against the cabin walls. By the 3rd night, though, the silence changed. It started with Max. Usually he would sleep near the stove, close enough to keep warm but never restless. That night, after I turned the lantern off and slid into the cot, I heard him moving around. His nails clicked across the old wooden floor, stopping and starting again, always aimed at the door. At first I thought maybe a raccoon had wandered close, or a deer was moving through the brush outside. I told myself it was normal, but Max didn't settle. He kept pacing, his ears pricked forward, his tail stiff. I sat up after an hour of this. The cabin felt colder than it had the other nights. I could hear the wind rattling the loose metal on the roof, but beneath it, there was something else. A sound like branches snapping, slow and deliberate, coming from the dark tree line. Max's head turned with it every time. I pulled on my boots and grabbed the flashlight. When I opened the door, the beam cut across the clearing and into the trees, but nothing moved. The sound stopped the moment I stepped outside, leaving only the steady slap of the wind against the lake. Max stayed right against my leg, his hackles up, a low growl rolling in his chest. I circled the cabin, light flashing between the trunks, but all I saw was black woods. I went back inside, locked the door, and forced myself to lie back down. Sleep came in short stretches. Every time I drifted off, Max's low growl or the crunch outside snapped me awake. At one point, just before dawn, I could have sworn I heard footsteps, human footsteps, moving across the leaves. Slow, steady, not rushing, almost like whoever it was wanted me to hear them. By morning, I was exhausted. I tried to laugh it off while I made coffee on the stove. Maybe a bear had been wandering. Maybe I had worked myself up in the quiet. The daylight made everything look smaller and safer. Still, I couldn't shake how focused Max had been. Dogs don't imagine things. The day passed quietly again. I split more wood, walked down the dirt road with Max, and tried to convince myself the night had been nothing. By evening, I felt better. I built a fire in the stove, cooked some canned stew, and sat at the little table while Max chewed on a bone. I almost convinced myself I had overreacted until darkness came. The second night was worse. From the first hour after sundown, the noises started. Sticks snapping, leaves crunching, weight shifting in the trees. Not random, not scattered, steady, like someone circling the clearing. Max stood at the door, teeth bared, the deep rumble in his throat never stopping. I sat with the flashlight in one hand and a hatchet in the other, my eyes on the door. At some point, something brushed against the cabin wall. It wasn't the wind. It was heavy, dragging slow along the outside boards. Then it stopped under the window. I froze. The glass was old and thin, with no curtains. I didn't move. Max's growl rose higher, sharper. I forced myself to shine the flashlight at the window, but there was nothing there. Just my reflection and Max's silhouette against the glass. The noise moved again, around the corner, toward the back. I thought about running outside, shining the light, yelling to scare it off. But every part of me said not to. Instead, I sat there through the night, gripping that hatchet, the fire dying down to nothing while the noises came and went outside. Sometime near morning, the sounds faded away. Max finally lay down, but he didn't sleep. His ears stayed up, his body tense, until the first light pushed through the trees. By the third day, I was done pretending it was in my head. I packed my gear and thought about leaving early, but something in me didn't want to drive back 5 hours and explain to people that I'd cut my trip short because of noises. Pride kept me there, though I knew it was stupid. I decided I'd stay one more night, and if anything happened again, I'd leave at dawn. That last night was the worst of all. The moment the light drained from the lake, the sounds returned. Louder now, more deliberate. Sticks snapping closer, footsteps circling tighter. At one point, I heard the crunch of leaves directly on the porch, right outside the door. Max went berserk, barking so loud the whole cabin shook, throwing himself against the wood. I dragged him back and pressed my shoulder against the door, certain something was about to push through. But nothing came. Not the door opening, not the window breaking. Just more circling, more dragging steps. Then silence. The kind of silence that makes your ears ring. I didn't sleep at all that night. I sat there with every light I had turned on, Max pressed against my leg, the hatchet in my hand. I kept waiting for something to happen, something to break through the fear and show itself. But nothing ever did. When dawn finally came, I didn't waste time. I stuffed everything into the truck, barely took the time to make sure the stove was out, and left the cabin behind. Max didn't relax until we hit pavement, his body finally easing in the passenger seat as if he knew we were safe. I never found out who or what it was. Maybe some stranger living out there, maybe just someone messing with me, maybe something as simple as a poacher moving through the woods at night. All I know is it wasn't an animal and it wasn't in my head. The way those steps circled the cabin, the way it paused under the window, the weight of it against the wall. I still hear it sometimes when I close my eyes. I never went back to that cabin. I don't think I could. The memory of that night clings to me every time the air gets cold and the wind rattles the roof. I can ignore it most of the time, but not all of it. Max is gone now. He passed a few years later, and sometimes I wonder if he understood better than I ever did what was waiting in those woods, just beyond the tree line, circling, patient, never quite stepping into the light. I had rented the cabin because I wanted to get away from everything for a while. It was the summer of 1998, and I was 28 years old, working long shifts in a warehouse in southern Indiana. My back hurt most days, my head was never clear, and all I wanted was silence. A coworker of mine told me about an old place tucked deep in the woods, about an hour north of French Lick. He said it was nothing fancy but cheap, and nobody would bother me out there. That was exactly what I was looking for. The cabin sat back off a rough gravel road, hidden behind thick trees that made the afternoon light feel dim, even on bright days. It was small, just a single story with a screened-in porch, the wood darkened and warped by age. The windows were clouded, the kind of glass that looked wavy when you stood close to it. A shallow ditch ran behind it, and beyond that was nothing but forest. No other houses in sight. No traffic, no hum of highways. Just insects and the occasional crow. I parked my old Chevy pickup out front and carried in the few things I brought. Some canned food, bottled water, a lantern, a cheap sleeping bag, and a small cooler with ice that I knew wouldn't last long. The cabin smelled like damp wood, like it had been closed up for too long. Dust hung in the air, and when I set my bag down, it stirred into the beams of light cutting through the cracks. The first day passed slow. I swept out the floor with an old broom I found leaning against the wall. I opened the windows to let air move through. I walked down the ditch until I found a trail that looked like deer used it more than people. The forest felt heavy, the kind of quiet where every twig snapping under my boots sounded too loud. I told myself it was exactly what I came for. That night, I lay in the sleeping bag on the floor. The boards creaked with every shift of my weight, and somewhere under the cabin I heard scratching. Probably a raccoon or some other animal. I pulled the bag tighter and kept still. When I finally drifted off, it was to the sound of crickets echoing through the open window. The second night, I started noticing things. I was outside just before dark, sitting on the porch with a can of beans, when I thought I saw something move down the tree line. Not close, maybe 50 yards off, but just enough of a flicker that I froze. I stared hard, but there was nothing. The woods were still. No wind, no birds, just me, sitting there, spoon halfway to my mouth, feeling my stomach tighten. After a minute, I convinced myself it was just a deer slipping past. Later, as I tried to sleep, I heard the boards on the porch creak. Slow. One, then a pause. Another. The kind of sound footsteps make when someone is testing weight. My eyes shot open, heart pounding so loud I thought whoever was outside could hear it. I didn't move. I just stared into the dark, my hand gripping the lantern beside me. The creak stopped. I waited for hours, ears straining, until the night was silent again. By the third day, I started checking around the cabin more carefully. I walked the perimeter, scanning the soft dirt for tracks. I found a few deer prints and some raccoon marks, but nothing that looked like boots. Still, I couldn't shake the unease. The woods felt different now, like they were watching me as much as I was watching them. That evening, I built a small fire in the pit out back. The smoke curled up between the trees, and I sat close to it, letting the warmth fight off the damp chill. I kept glancing over my shoulder. Every snap of a branch or rustle of leaves made me turn my head quick. At one point, I thought I saw a shadow move behind a tree, but it disappeared before I could focus. I stayed outside until the fire burned low, then went back in and barred the door with a chair. Sleep didn't come easy. I kept hearing noises, not just the usual critters this time. Heavy steps, slow, deliberate, circling the cabin. The crunch of leaves, the shift of weight on the porch. I held my breath, every muscle locked, waiting for a knock, a shove, some sign that the door wouldn't hold. But nothing came. Hours later, when the sky finally lightened, the sounds stopped. The next morning, I found prints in the dirt near the porch. They weren't animals. They were boots, big ones, clear tread marks, fresh, pressed deep into the soil from the rain the night before. I crouched there, staring at them, my skin crawling. Someone had been standing right outside while I was inside, listening, watching. I told myself to leave, just get in the truck and go. But something in me didn't want to run yet. I told myself maybe it was some hunter passing through, maybe some local messing with me. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that whoever it was wanted me gone. Or worse, that night was the worst. I stayed awake, lantern burning low, back against the wall. The woods outside were alive with sounds I couldn't place. At one point, I heard metal scrape against the door latch. Soft, slow, like someone testing it. My throat went dry. I gripped the handle of the hatchet I'd brought for chopping wood, holding it tight to my chest. Hours dragged. The scratching under the cabin returned, louder now, but I knew it wasn't an animal. The boards above creaked in rhythm with it, as if weight shifted along with the noise. Then silence again. That silence was worse than the sounds. When dawn finally came, I went outside, every step tight with dread. The prints were back, deeper, circling the cabin. Whoever it was had walked around me all night. On the side of the cabin, just below the window, I saw marks in the dirt. Kneeling prints pressed hard, facing the glass. Someone had been crouching there, watching me through the night. That was it. I threw everything into the truck as fast as I could. Sleeping bag, cooler, lantern, all of it tossed in without care. I didn't look back at the cabin. I didn't even shut the door. I just climbed into the driver's seat and turned the key. The truck roared to life, and I floored it down that gravel road, dust rising behind me in the mirrors. My hands shook on the wheel, my stomach knotted tight. I didn't stop until I hit the main highway, and even then, I kept driving for miles, checking the rear view like I expected to see someone following. I never went back. I never asked about the cabin again. To this day, I don't know who was out there or what they wanted. But I know this: if I had stayed one more night, if I had ignored the prints, the sounds, the creaking boards, I might not have made it out. And whenever I think of that cabin, all I can picture is those kneeling prints by the window, pressed deep into the mud, and the thought of someone watching me while I tried to sleep.